We're now live with the October 21st edition of the Node.js module team. I'm joined with myself and what was 6 other members, although one of them has vanished, 5 other members of the team at this exact moment. We've got not a super packed agenda, but we've definitely got some meaty topics to discuss. So the one item that we had on the agenda that was actually on the agenda was number 553, empty matching patterns. Guy, would you like to take this one up?
Sure, I think we carried this one over last week because we didn't want to, well, either we were hitting time on the discussion, and also at the same time we were looking to have some follow-ups. There haven't been any further follow-ups in the threads or out-of-band discussions. So I think the discussion will probably go much the same as it did in the last meeting. And unless we have any new aspects or approaches to discuss it from.
If I could add, I have to drop at 30 after. So if we want to maybe discuss this, could it be at the end or after the other thing?
Okay, so want to move on to the other issues and then come back to this one?
That sounds.
Okay, so I think the order of operations here that would make sense would be to start with a discussion about the experimental status and then follow with the discussion about like the ongoing nature of this group, because I feel like those two are rather hand in hand. So I don't know if anyone can help with notes right now, but it would be helpful. Here's the, I'll drop in the chat link to the doc. At the very least, if you could add your name, that'd be good. So we've got the this issue that Guy opened yesterday about the experimental status of modules. I went through and came up with a little bit an outline of things, kind of like breaking, like separating between the core like ESM implementation features versus package features. And 1 hour ago, someone chimed in asking about the VM-ESM APIs and asking if we've forgotten about them. So I should add that to the list as well. And I believe that there's also kind of like, I'll add like a list for kind of like other features. We've got the VM-ESM API, and then I think that, I guess we've, oh, Jeff, you're still there. Jeff, what were the ones that you were bringing up as well that we didn't have?
Well, I guess before we move on to the VM API, the main thing there, it's not just experimental, but it's also incomplete because it doesn't offer an equivalent. There's no like the equivalent to like VM.script where you can just like run a string essentially as if you're like calling it an eval. Like there is no equivalent built yet for that. The same way that like if you wanted to do, you know, from the command line node input type equals module eval something, some string. We don't have a way to do that yet in Node core, and that's a blocker for TS node. It's a blocker for the coffee command. It's a blocker for Babel. Like any utility that wants to like transpile into ESM JavaScript and then have it be executed by Node. The only way they can do it right now is to like launch a child process and pass it in as like in, you know, the string into input type, etc. So that's something that we need to add to the list of like a missing feature we really need to add. I don't think that's controversial at all. It just hasn't been built. The other ones that I remembered were we currently have no way to do hot module reload. And that's a problem for the build tools that currently do hot module reload using CJS. I think like Gil came up with a hacky way of doing it, of adding a like a unique query string on the end of an import statement, but without a way to remove the old module from the module cache, the node process will just gradually take up more and more memory. You know, the longer it's running, the longer a dev is working and he keeps hitting save. So I don't think it's really, I don't think we can consider that a solved problem just yet, since essentially it's only solved with a memory leak. The other one was instrumentation. That might be, I mean, I think that will be solvable through loaders. I'm not sure if it's, if loaders are complete enough for it. I think that was part of the motivation behind that, like, global preload code thing that Jan added, but I'm not sure if there's any missing functionality for instrumentation that those tools are rating on. Maybe chaining. They're rating on chaining. They need chaining for loaders in order for that to work. So yeah, so there's probably a few pieces for instrumentation with loaders.
Okay, well, I mean, for what it's worth, I don't think we should spend too much time on those things because I don't believe any of those things are blocking our ability of calling modules themselves stable. So
I feel like we should put these somewhere though, like maybe the README for the models team
just
or
added
something.
it
We should
to,
have this list so we don't forget like what is still to do, you know, with ESM stuff, you know.
yeah, I added the that list that we just came up with to my tracking issue, and we can revisit. So I guess like one core thing that I wanted to maybe just see how people are feeling about to start with would be, do people agree with this assessment that like we likely should separate package features, which are features that affect both ESM and CommonJS, such as type module, input type, package exports, imports, conditional exports, subpath exports and imports, export trigger, nested conditions, and subpath patterns. Those are kind of like one category, whereas ESM itself is another category, which is like the loader named exports, node imports, data imports, import meta built-in modules, create, require, the resolution algorithm, top level await, CommonJS named exports, JSON modules, WASM modules, loaders, and experimental specifier resolution. Are there any, does anyone disagree with separating those two things from a stability perspective?
Separating.
I think it makes sense to do that.
Sort of classification.
Pardon?
I mean, when you say separate them into categories, but I mean, in terms of what meaning do those categories hold, or is it just a grouping?
Well, I think it's more of a grouping. And then also when we're talking about stability, we could talk about like the package features being marked as stable when ESM itself may not yet be marked as stable.
I guess from that perspective, that would be my concern about this grouping, because I feel like stability kind of is completely orthogonal to that kind of a grouping.
Well, for me, I think that separating them into these groupings makes it easier to have the discussions about stability or experimental status or whatever. Like we may want to tie the two groupings together for one of those things, but it still feels useful to me to categorize them that way.
I guess the big difference that I would make, Guy, is like, it feels like to me, and I could be wrong, when we talk about like ESM and Node, like specifically ESM, we could say that ESM is stable, but subpath patterns may not be stable yet. And I don't think that like subpath patterns not being stable should block calling the ESM implementation itself stable.
Right, but I mean, I'm saying that yeah, there's package features which could be considered unstable, but there's also core features which can be considered unstable. So I'd be wary of making any blanket judgments for package features.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I was thinking about, and perhaps this is like, this could be a core thing, is like, it feels to me like package features could likely be considered stable individually as each of those features. Some of them obviously need to be grouped, but like we could call like I think it goes without saying that package exports at this point is stable, but subpath patterns isn't. Subpath exports are, nested conditions are, Like, and those were kind of the ways I was breaking it down.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. That makes complete sense to me. And if we want to just start going through the list, we can do that on these.
Yeah, and then I guess the only difference that I would say is for ESM, because I don't think that you really can like tease these apart cleanly in the same way. I feel like, and in particular, CommonJS named exports is like the only one that seems to be like not quite there yet. I feel like we can't call ESM stable until kind of like all the features in that grouping are stable, but we could start like stabilizing package features.
Right. I think the part where I'm not quite following on that, and like the only difference between CommonJS exports and subpath blob patterns is it's a very fine difference from a how tightly it's coupled to ESM overall. Like in both cases, you are importing something and you get different results depending on whether the feature is supported or not. So it feels roughly equally tight or separable from the core ESM support. So I would say that we could call core ESM support stable while still saying that CommonJS named imports are experimental.
And I guess for me, that is maybe somewhere where I don't feel super comfortable because people don't necessarily know when they're importing and doing a named import from something. But I guess the same could be said about like nested conditions or any of these features that are being used by module authors. I guess maybe that's a big difference is like like the module consumer is using those core ESM features, whereas it's the module author using the package features.
Well, I mean, that named CommonJS exports are also something that the consumer might not be aware. Like they are just following the README, they're importing something from a package that they have no knowledge of.
I guess to me, it's like, it's so fundamental to the way in which ESM works. And I'm not saying that we should wait forever for it, but it's like, we just shipped it. So we should wait like maybe a month or two, get some feedback, make sure there aren't bugs. But like, I think simply put, I think that, I guess if we step back, I would say right now, CommonJS named exports are the only thing that I think are blocking calling the main ESM implementation stable at this point. I just dropped the issue into the chat if you all want to take a look at how it's the order that I've put in there in case anyone, disagrees with anything there. But I think to an example in the other way is like top level await, I would say is probably still arguably an experimental feature until, like it's actually shipped in Chrome, although we are arguably may also want to say top level await is an experimental feature until it's like stage 4. But that shouldn't block us calling like the ESM implementation stable.
That seems fair to me.
So does anyone have particular thoughts on this right now?
There's one other feature I can think of, user conditions. So the flag for setting user conditions, I would like if we could include that as stable because production development workflows rely on that quite heavily if you want to set like a development condition in your conditional exports. So, I mean, but I guess it also depends on if we're documenting. I don't think we're documenting it as having an unstable state at the moment. And then do you want to discuss VM at all as well, Miles?
I mean, I would leave it really easily as I don't think that the VM modules work blocks us calling ESM stable. I see that as like an additional feature in the same way that like I don't think we would have loaders block. Doesn't mean that there isn't still a lot of work to do there, but I personally don't see the state of the VM module as being a blocker to calling ESM stable.
Sure, and we should have the full context to make that decision on its own as well.
I think there's a lot of value in making as many package-related features not experimental as soon as we can, so that people can just start, publishing packages that use these things, and getting that stuff more into the wild.
Is there an argument for making top-level await stable? Or because of the specification status at the moment, it just shouldn't be considered? I mean, if browsers are shipping a feature, I guess it is a tricky one. And strictly speaking, the TC39 spec is still, I guess, not at a stable, would you call it?
I mean, stage 3 features are like a gray area, but I think that for Node specifically, because it's on top of V8, right? Like Miles implied earlier that when V8 implements it, that Node will have to make some changes. Is that right?
Yeah, if there, I would imagine so.
So to me, that more than the spec status is the variability, is the risk with Node's implementation of top level await. Like as soon as Chrome has shipped it and Node is using that same implementation, then I suspect that it will be highly unlikely that there would be any changes after that. And it wouldn't necessarily need stage 4 for Node to be able to call it stable.
So maybe it could be a follow-up at that point.
Yeah, it seems a little risky to me to make that one considered stable before we have a browser equivalent, so that like we can see that it behaves the same way in both.
Yeah, and it's like I don't believe, but I could be wrong. I don't believe that the HTML integration has fully gone through yet, and not expecting that to have major changes to how it works or how our implementation works. But I think it's inaccurate to call it stable until that's done.
Okay, so then it seems like we have some rough agreement on the status. Does anyone else have any other concerns?
I think we should just figure out what we want to do with VM in general. But that's not on status of ESM itself.
There was something that originally was driven by Gus, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and he's
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like one question, Brad, I would have to you is, do you think that we'll see realms anytime soon?
I think Chrome is going to continue blocking them.
Yeah, because like that would really be like the longer term solution.
Good interface. I mean, it does have some similarities with compartments as well. So there's definitely crossover in both those design spaces. Where foreseeably in the future, those like compartment shipping could affect the VM API design. I don't know. What do you think, Bradley?
I mean, regardless of blocks, I think realms and compartments are a significant chunk of work and time away from being viable
I'd say
for us to use it in Node.
Given Chrome's complaints, they're at least 5 years out.
We'll have nuclear fusion before we have realms.
Well, they fundamentally want to try anything else before having separated global state. So,
I think you're about to do what I was going to do, so go for it.
Getting back to VM though, I looked into it like a year ago, so my memory's a little hazy if someone can remember better, but it's not that far from being ready, if I remember right. I mean, it's experimental. I think what we really just needs, like the difference between, the command line eval with input type and the Node one is that the Node API that you'd have to call is the Node API requires like 100 lines of boilerplate that are in the docs that you would have to copy paste to implement like your own function for how the module should be linked together and so on. I think that like all we really need is like another API or a slight modification of the current API that just has defaults for those, like for the linking function and such, that just behaves the way Node does it, like the linker from the Node loader, and that's that, which I'm sure is what happens with the command line version. So it's probably not that much work.
So the last time I tried to use it to actually get more or less correct behavior for something that wants to have its own VM module-based loading, you basically had to re-implement module loader, loader job, and everything around it in userland. So the functions in the docs are not realistically sufficient unless you have a play example when you actually want to do proper linking. So I think the chunk of work, from my perspective at least, to make VM modules actually nice and usable would be to expose module loader and loader job to some degree, which is more work than just patching up some minor things.
Well, couldn't you just make them the defaults without exposing them? Like if I don't specify my own module load function, it uses the Node internal one?
I think there's two separate use cases for the VM module. One is I just want to eval, but otherwise I want to delegate to nodes module loading. In that case, you can just create a data URL and import that, and you get kind of the same thing. So I'm not even sure how much the VM module has to be involved with that. But if you are doing something like Jest and you want to virtualize the entire module graph, and you do not want to delegate to the node's own module graph at all, it's not just a matter of defaults. Like you have to actually provide all the loading and linking and patching that you would get from kind of loader hooks.
So we want to probably provide chunks of our implementation to be available so that, you know, the people implementing Jest don't have to rewrite everything from scratch, in other words.
Yeah, I think the thing I really regret is that we merged VM module separate from context, so that now every single script has a property for which module loader to use. In theory, what we could have done is to associate the loading with a context and have VM create context basically be able to take loader hooks that you can set as part of the construction of a VM context. And that way, I think everything would be a lot easier, but it would be a departure from how it works right now.
I'd prefer that, but at the time, Gus wanted, in particular, the ability to insert a VM source text module into the current context's module map. And so that was a large part of the decision for why it was designed.
Yeah, but that's currently not possible, right? You can't get into the current module map
currently.
Yeah. So the design was chosen for a goal that ultimately didn't end up happening.
We are still able to do that goal. It just like it doesn't mesh well with other features, which is why it is currently an error that we explicitly check for.
Yeah.
If we're nitpicking design decisions, another thing that I would have liked to have seen would have been the ability to have like a singular set of hooks into a linking function, as opposed to kind of passing around this resolve, having individual resolve functions into each module for the initialize import meta and import module dynamically hooks, because you end up having to create a function closure for every single module for those two.
Yeah, I think that was part of what I described maybe poorly for the associate with the VM create context.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we are talking about the same kind of problem where it's super awkward right now that you have to create it for every single thing. And then also, if anything in your virtual, but effectively realm is a script, then it becomes even more awkward, I think, right now. Because if you want to have dynamic import from the script, then you also need to take care of that, including eval and stuff.
In the issue queue.
Yeah.
So
one thing that we do have to take note of, if we do bind things to a context, V8 theoretically supports cross-context linkage, but they say not to do it because things may break. They are not actively trying to maintain that support. Yeah. Okay.
So kind of stepping back to the discussion that we were having, one thing that's worth pointing out also is that I did open a pull request against Node to flip a handful of these APIs to be, the package features to be considered stable. I can drop this into the chat. So I guess two questions that I think would be, I would like to have answered by folks. One would be, do you agree with the assessment in that I put there of saying, like, essentially of the package features, subpath patterns being the only one that is not stable? And are people okay with us stabilizing these before we stabilize ESM itself? Does anyone have any problems with that?
I think
No.
we're missing some CommonJS tests was my only thing.
And like, it's worth noting, conditional exports have been causing chaos in the React community for the past 2 weeks.
So,
Oh, really?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
Webpack 5 supports them, as it were, but the new React APIs that are coming out require nested imports that are defined to not use extensions, while they don't provide an exports map that says that they don't use extensions. So when you're actually trying to use real ESM, which Webpack 5 is trying to, things fall apart, and they can't change it because it breaks Preact if they do. It's fun times for everybody, really.
So Sakura added a change yesterday to fix exactly that, and they added extension searching back.
Exactly. So like the fix for Webpack is like, don't do actual Node ESM resolution. So like, consider.
Is this so they're pointing exports to a file that doesn't include the extension?
No, so what it is there's a new React API that implicitly adds imports to files. So things that act as transpilers, like Webpack or what have you, or Babel or something, have to add imports to the file, like, for the user. And those imports are defined, or at least were initially defined, to not have extensions on them. All right. Now, because React originally didn't have an exports map, this meant that this didn't work when you were actually using ESM as your output rather than CommonJS. So they changed it so that you included the extensions on the inputs. However, Preact had already shipped an update that included an exports field, so adding the extensions broke Preact. And so what ended up happening there is Webpack itself had to change so that it could look it up with or without the extension and ignore node module resolution.
But to be clear, we're dealing with resolving packages that don't have an exports field at all.
No. This is a conflict between packages that do and do not. Preact has an exports field. React does not. It's just
okay.
But then Webpack's implementation was
export field didn't support.
And so the fix from Webpack, because React decided it wasn't their problem and Preact said they're doing the right thing, the fix from Webpack is to ignore how exports are supposed to work and do extension searching anyway.
Because they're not doing extension. Oh, they are doing extension searching when there's an exports field for Preact.
Yes. Correct.
Oh.
So yeah, it's just
to get it straight.
The exports field how we expected it to be used.
Yeah,
And-
it's just like,
definitely not a portable fix.
No.
And it's going to break in other environments. So yeah,
like there is definite confusion as to the safety of adding exports to a package, especially considering like we now have a bunch of people advocating that just add exports, don't use main, and that is causing problems actively as tools in people's tool chains start adding support for exports. Things start breaking.
It's more complicated than that. It's people are using the exports field expecting to have the CommonJS resolution algorithm. And in the case of...
no, I mean, React specifically defined an API with its exports. And then React went and changed its API when Preact is supposed to be mirroring its API. And then that didn't support the existing versions of Preact. So, I mean, in theory, the correct fix would have been for Preact to ship an update to update itself to the latest React API, supporting both with and without extensions.
It's worth noting, this also broke TSLib for TypeScript in the same way, doing the same thing, except our fix, rather than waiting on Webpack to figure out how to sort it out in a way for every package that has this problem, was to include some extra conditions just for Webpack, like a module condition and so on.
That was a slightly different problem in that was to do with the named exports, actually.
That's the other problem with Webpack 5. They don't actually want to follow everything about Node's module resolution. So
it's that these are, the strong edge cases that are coming up. I mean, we've got something like 1 in 100 packages has ES module, was it when we did the tests? Or I think 10% of packages, so 1 in 10. And then of that 10%, the ones that have that default conflict that you hit up against in TSLib are maybe like 1 in 50 or 1 in 100, or maybe even more of those. So we're dealing with like the sort of 0.1% and below cases here, or even more than that.
Is this just Webpack 5? Like Webpack 4 has no problem with this stuff?
Webpack 4 doesn't look at export maps, so obviously it has no problem with it. Webpack 4 still...
Webpack 5 has kind of made a lot of intentional choices to do things differently in a way that disrupts the ecosystem. So like, it kind of seems like persuading Webpack to more closely match what the ecosystem expects is a better solution than anything else. But like,
the problem for Webpack is that they're trying to straddle what Webpack 4 did and what Node's new ESM resolver does, and trying to get something in the middle that is still broadly ecosystem compatible.
Right.
And so just to clarify on the React side, so does React itself has exports? And if so, if they don't have a export for /hooks without an extension, isn't that incompatible with every single piece of code written against React?
So it's not that React has exports. React actually explicitly doesn't have exports yet. It's Preact that has exports. And so React changing whether or not their transpilation plugins added extensions to their imports was a breaking change for non-React packages that did have exports, like Preact, which was unexpected, to say the least. But that's...
Wasn't that as a reaction to Webpack 5 not finding them, which would be
correct? It was a reaction to Webpack 5 not finding them because they were respecting the import maps. Yeah, exactly.
So Webpack 5 did disable extension searching for packages that didn't use exports, because React didn't use exports, and they didn't do extension searching.
I think it was React was trying to be more compatible by using extensions. And then that, so I guess maybe the confusion...
Yeah, like I believe the complaint was, I can't run this module verbatim in the browser because it doesn't include an extension or something, like, the origin of,
the missing
extensions in this group, and so...
Right.
And so they decided to add it to the extensions, except adding extensions broke all the people who added export maps without extensions.
I guess they're trying to be good citizens and move to the way things are going, which is using explicit extensions. but they've actually misinterpreted the guidance around using extensions. The guidance is explicitly that you use extensions when you're loading local paths within the package. But now that we've got subpath patterns, we want to try and encourage never using extensions when loading subpaths with external packages. That's actually, I think we could maybe even say the official guidance of this group. And in effect, React, we're not following that guidance. Maybe they misunderstood what it means to include extensions.
So I don't know if we should actually make such a recommendation explicitly.
This will always be an issue, though, for users importing a package and not knowing when to use extensions or not. I mean, like that.
Correct. That's the
It
exact
is an ongoing confusion,
yeah.
and we are in some way responsible for that.
Yeah, that's the exact issue. But on the web, you would need the extensions.
Not
Well, it depends
necessarily.
on the serving system.
Well, I mean, the point
Yeah.
is the web doesn't have package lookups. So the moment you have a specifier that's non-relative, the web throws its hands up in the air and goes, I do nothing with this. So
But we're kind of trying to lay the groundwork for you not to have extensions in your import map left-hand side entries.
Right. And while it's great
But
that we've enabled that, we
taking-
also made an explicit choice to not make that easy by not we chose to not have the resolution that picks between extension or no automatically. So we essentially created the issue where some packages are going to choose to use extensions on the left-hand side and some are not. And that means users are going to have to figure out either by reading or by experimenting which form to use for every single package individually.
And in this case, the experiment only played itself out.
and whether that extension is .js or MJS, because they won't know which it is in advance.
Or whatever else, yeah.
That would be far too complex for large dependency trees to really understand this.
It is already that complex, right? I mean,
Yeah,
but it's not dependency trees that you need to worry about, right? It's just one level. So it's just the top level dependencies that you have.
Yeah, and even for the one level, the big point for me why I think the guidance for bare specifiers don't use extensions is correct is because it is the only choice that survives transpilation across a tree. If you add an explicit extension and then your dependency wants to have different file extensions for CommonJS versus ESM, then your code can no longer be transpiled because in its transpiled form, it would potentially need to use a different extension in a specifier, and now your transpilation is a lot harder. And all your examples now need to have different specifiers for different audio systems if the extension is in there.
And we also added type module. So we also guaranteed that there's you can't rely on a single extension being a single thing throughout your graph. So like that also adds to this problem, I think.
Yeah, but taking a step back on like what it means for exports as experimental, I definitely agree that there is confusion about how to use exports correctly. And the confusion will continue as more and more people are using it. I think our guidance in the docs in theory already covers this as far as I remember, and would have pointed them roughly in the right direction of not having the extension, and it is /hooks, not /hooks.js. And if they would have used export maps instead of depending on subpath serving being wide open for web usage, if they would have used export maps, actually they wouldn't have had this problem because they wouldn't have had added the extension because they would have depended on the export mapping for /hooks. So this is actually an example where React ran into a problem because they did not depend on exports. They depended on pre-export behavior. So I'm not sure if this is actually something about export stability, because it was something that was actually caused by somebody not using exports.
That Webpack fix does worry me because it means that Webpack's potentially now basically intentionally not following the spec for exports. And as a result, any resolver implementations that do follow the spec are not necessarily going to match the ecosystem where Webpack meets them. And that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of annoying.
Yeah, I've long suspected, like I've already known that I would like need to have a resolver for Node's new ESM format, like with exports and all that jazz and TypeScript, and then a separate one for like browser that supports actual ESM. I'd also need one for Webpack now as well, just for the subtle edge case differences between Webpack and Node, which is unfortunate.
Well, I mean, it's
but at least Webpack is a superset, right?
No, it's not a superset at all of either.
Webpack isn't the ecosystem. I mean, I know it feels like it sometimes, but yeah.
It's a big
So
part of
do
it.
we know why Preact didn't want to just add those extensions?
Because they had already done a major
Or-
bump to add exports.
Or why React didn't add the exports field for React 17.
It's a patch for Preact to add those extra extensions, and that would have been the easy fix.
Yeah, but it was just the bump. They didn't want to bump.
I mean, like people have been going around submitting pull requests to add exports to packages and saying like this is a major semver break change, so bump the version when you do it, like all across the ecosystem.
But also
right?
almost a year now, I think I've made it very clear to the React team that I'm more than happy to write a PR adding the exports field as soon as they tell me they want it. I've made that offer to a number of packages, and like, so it's not that they even had work to do. All they had to do was give me a thumbs up.
The problem is this is all contributing to like some serious FUD, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing if people adopt it cautiously and we slowly sort of integrate it through the ecosystem. At the same time, there are clear guidelines that you can follow, and you can do this stuff safely and without, and so yeah, it's a tricky line. I mean, the worry with going too slowly is Webpack starts to do a whole bunch of stuff that then sort of changes the direction of these specs that we've carefully worked out, and then we're back to compatibility issues when we want to move off Webpack into ESBuild or other tools that are then just wanting to support Webpack.
I'm assuming Webpack has issues with state all of this. Is that a bad assumption?
To my knowledge, Webpack is just doing whatever it feels right currently.
Okay.
I would put it as Webpack gets overrun with people who run into every single edge case because they have enough coverage that they run into every single edge case. And so it's in Webpack's interest to make the support requests go away.
Sure facts. If your build breaks for your browser web page, it'll show a Webpack error and you go to Webpack. All right, that's just what it is.
Yeah,
right, but you should go to the package that has the bad config, and if Webpack has the mentality that it's just going to fix every single case, I mean, then we're back to that's the root cause of compatibility issues. And maybe it's good for Webpack because they get to make sure that their unique semantics can't be replicated, and you have to use Webpack. But yeah, that's not what we're aiming for here.
So
I think what would help is good.
We're kind of passing blame around right now, and we have a few things we could do that are more actionable than passing blame around. One is there some way we could have provided detection for this change? In particular, the missing exports and added exports. I'm wondering if we could go and actually do kind of, NPM does this now where it's an edit difference on certain package names. I wonder if we could look into adding that to these tools rather than having them go and change their resolution. And this would actually also encourage people like Preact, because it would, instead of pointing the problem at Webpack, it would point it directly at Preact, which was what was missing the exports field for those with extensions. There's also linting things we could do around if you are adding stuff and you don't have the extension, I mean, we could at least for now encourage linting against it while the ecosystem is upgrading piecemeal. So that's more actionable than arguing about what Webpack should or shouldn't do. Also, when we're talking about things like these edge cases, just how can we give users feedback so that they can take control of things? So one of the problems here is that users couldn't alter Preact to have this act did it on their behalf by changing Webpack's resolver. We have exports as an integrity mechanism. I'm wondering if we could have introduced some way to more easily override what's on disk when they start up their application. So yeah, I think we really just need to figure out how we can solve the problems rather than state that they are problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like guidance, what we have in the documentation, and adjusting that as these things come up. Bradley, could you just clarify your original proposal one more time as well that you suggested there?
So what we saw, at least in Preact, is that a exports field, when introduced, did not have all the entries as expected if you use the CommonJS resolver. We could make a linting library or something like that that lints the package JSON, and at least for now says, hey, the entries in your exports field do not conform to everything that a CommonJS resolver would have.
I already have 90% of that tool built.
Yeah. I think we have all the pieces. We just don't push it out anywhere currently.
Yeah. I mean, like I'm almost tempted to say that like the confusion was the subpaths that subpaths shouldn't have extensions. I mean, I think if we could maybe agree to push that quite strongly, or if not in this group, you know, maybe in other ways. But I feel like people like it's the understanding the distinction between subpath extensions on packages and using extensions in relative specifiers. And if there was some way to get that information across, that also would have avoided this. So maybe there's some docs guidance that could be added along those lines.
Yeah, it might also help if we, I think for the Webpack case specifically, it would have helped if there would be a clear web compatibility connection. So if we could influence import maps and make it go more quickly so that export stops being a Node thing and starts being a JavaScript thing, I think it would help both on the React side and the Webpack side to rephrase this from this is a Node idiosyncrasy to this is how bare specifiers work in JavaScript thing.
It would also definitely help if we like got package publishing toolchains like Yarn and NPM to check this kind of thing automatically on publish, rather than relying on Dogma that we attempt to push out and teach to people. Because, well, relying on education doesn't scale particularly well.
Well, in this case, the issue appears if not in React, not in Preact, but in a project that aliases the React name to Preact. So I think you wouldn't have found it by analyzing Preact, you wouldn't have found it by analyzing React on publish. You would only find it once you link the two together with a very particular configuration.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this problem doesn't scale as much as we think it might. The concern is just if the Webpack patch inadvertently creates patterns that then, you know, are now their new compatibility thing. But yeah, linting on publish is a huge one. And, you know, if we were able to suggest not using extensions in exports, I would suggest even having linters lint if you're not exporting the non-extension form, and say it's normally advised to also make an export without the extension. because that was actually React's misunderstanding, was thinking that they should be advocating for React / hooks.js or whatever it was. So kind of linting the .js and saying you should make an entry just without the extension. I don't know if we can collaborate with any package teams on these kind of things, or if TypeScript linters. I've seen TypeScript's got some great linting for exports field as well these days.
Do we? We don't support the exports field at all yet. What?
I'm getting exports package JSON linting in my VS Code. If it's not TypeScript, who is it?
Oh, that's VS Code itself. It does JSON schema validation on all JSON files.
Yeah, I'm getting proper exports validation, and even caught something where I'd actually entered the wrong exports. I was like, oh,
yeah, it's because that's all part of the JSON schema for the package.json.
That's amazing.
Right?
Where is that sourced?
Schemastore.org. The tsconfig.json and jsconfig.json schemas are also up there. Every well-known JSON document.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, VS Code pulls the schemas from all of those, and that's how you get stuff in like JSON documents and YAML files and stuff.
So it would appear that we have run through our timing. We're out of time. I guess we should wait until the next meeting to have the discussions about if we're going to keep having meetings. I guess one last thing as we talk about stabilization, does anyone have concerns about that plan of partially stabilizing? Like, should we not be stabilizing these things right now based on the conversation we had right now? Or is this, independent?
I think my only disagreement would be that I would be even more aggressive in stabilizing and also stabilizing ESM right now. Just CommonJS exports, I would still name experimental, and the rest I would just stabilize right now. So no objection to stabilizing anything from me.
Okay.
Like I personally am like, it can stabilize, but like I'm like, so the members of my team that like were informed of the situations that arose in the past couple of weeks, or just like, we're not having support for this in the near future, right? This is clearly unstable, right? I'm just like, well, for now it is. Yep, thumbs up. Definitely unstable right now. It's like, it doesn't feel stable to people who are looking.
What in particular?
I mean, that's
just
the reason to stabilize.
Yeah,
if people are still like, the stabilization problem is a usage problem at this point. It's nothing we can do.
I mean, like, we can try and implement things in like the things that we have like influence over, like Node itself and NPM, that like make it easier to fall into the pit of success, right?
Yeah, I think the problem is that we are getting more and more into chicken and egg problems, where people, in order to use it, need support in a bunch of different ecosystem tools, and the ecosystem tools look at the experimental status and say, well, we won't support this while it is experimental. And so important projects don't use it because the tools don't support it, which means we don't get really better signal, or like there's just, it cannot really be used right now to the full extent, because we can't really solve these issues, because the tools that we would need to solve issues don't even support it, because they can't support something experimental. So it's, I think stabilizing in our docs is a good signal that we would expect ecosystem tools to help us stabilize it.
I mean, yeah, the point is that the stabilization that we're talking about is the fact that Node.js is making a promise to its users that what is implemented is not going to change, and that they can build on top of it, and they can rely on these semantics, and things are not going to break out from under them. And I think that guarantee is the important signal that users need. And the fact is that we can't, the things that we're talking about marking stable, we can't even change them now that we've got this degree of usage of, what was it, 7 or 8,000, 4 or 5,000 packages with the exports field now. So yeah, I mean, the only thing is, sorry, I know we're going over time. I'm just thinking as I go here. The only thing is with exports, maybe we want to do the deprecation for trailing path in exports that we sort of silently docs deprecated. I don't know if that's something worth adding explicitly before stabilization in case anyone was relying on that.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should stop the stream and I have to get to another meeting. Do we want to kick this off to the stabilization issue that we have and move the conversation async?
Sounds good.
Sounds good.